Howdy, I'm Dan Abrams. I'm doing a tutorial today on how to composite 3D objects into 2D photographs of rooms using Corona Renderer inside of Cinema 4D. So what we're going to be doing is looking at how we can take this photo on the left and using camera mapping and shadow catchers in Corona, we can then composite an image like on the right, where we put in virtual furniture. And again, here's another angle and a bedroom as well. That's been done. So first things first, inside of Lightroom and Photoshop, I've created this picture combining some different exposures for this photograph. I'm not going to go into in depth on how to do HDR photography in this tutorial, but you can look online and find other tutorials that can show you how to create HDR photographs if you don't already know. Now, the one thing I will stress that is very important when you're taking your photographs, or if you're having other people take photographs for you, is that you make sure that everything is level and straight. So built into my Canon 7D, which I took this photo with, there's a built-in level, digital level that lets me know if the horizon is straight, and all the sort of verticals and that will be straight as well. Now, I did use a wide-angle lens. This actually was a Tokina 11 to 16 millimeter lens, and it was on the widest 11 millimeter for this photograph. So within Lightroom, I used the camera profiles just to correct any lens distortion and things like that, just to try and make these walls as straight as possible. Now, unfortunately, in the real world, there could be some error in the building, and the walls just aren't that straight, aren't perfect. But that's okay. We can get around that when we do the trickery later in Cinema 4D. So I've taken this photograph. So it was a combined image of different exposures as a HDR. I've exported it just as a JPEG, just as a normal 8-bit JPEG. It doesn't need to be a HDR image, even though we will be using this as a sky material for lighting. It does not need to be a HDRI. It doesn't need all that exposure, and I will show you why. So first things first, with this image in Photoshop, I'm just going to check the image size and see the pixels. So we got 5,071 pixels by 3,381 pixels. So first thing I'm going to do in Cinema 4D is go to my render settings, change the renderer to Corona, and make sure I change all the output sizes to that same dimensions. So it was 5,071, so just key that in, by 3,381. And I'm just going to lock the ratio, and just so I can pump out faster renders for preview, I will just divide that by 4 and just bring that overall resolution down, but keeping the same dimensions. Okay. In the Corona settings, I'm just going to turn on some high quality denoising as well, just for future, because we will need that later on. So I've got my render settings all keyed in. Now I'm going to go to the Corona tab and choose a Corona camera, and just activate that camera so we're looking through the lens there. And the focal length, now it was an 11 millimeter lens, so down here in the camera object, I'm just going to make that 11 millimeters. And the sensor size for the Canon 7D, the diagonal sensor size is about 26.82 millimeters. So I'm just going to key that in, try and get it as accurate to the real life camera as I can. Then I'm going to right click the camera object here in the browser here, and then just go to camera calibrator. And this is where we're going to put the 2D image in and calibrate the camera to match the perspective of the image. So again, down here in the attributes, just click on image, and here in the image we're just going to pump in that 2D photograph, and there we are. So first things first, we're going to go to calibrate, this tab here, and we're going to add our lines. Now this is our X, Y, and Z perspective lines, just to let the camera know which is the right orientation. So I'm just going to add my first line and just drag that down to the bottom of the skirting board here, and just drag that into the corner. I will be doing this tutorial quite quick. You can take your time and be a bit more accurate, and obviously get better results from doing so. So I'm going to make that the Z axis, the Z axis, as we say in England. So just mark that. What I'm doing here is holding Shift and clicking the line. And what that will do is change the color based on, as you can see down here, the sort of axis here. So you've got your red for the X axis, your green for the Y, and then your blue for the Z. So I'm just putting it in the Z. I'm going to add another line and do the top of the wall as well. So I'm just going to drag that roughly on that line there, maybe bring it into the corner. There we go, and make that the Z axis as well. Now I'm going to do the X axis, so again I'm going to drag this to the corner, the floor, and maybe to this corner. Mark that as the X, and then do the same for the top of the wall as well. So drag that up to here. Okay, now in my experience that's all you need. You don't need many lines. I don't ever do a Y-axis. In fact it tends to throw the camera calibrator off a little bit. So just doing a couple of Z and X axis. As you can see down here in the attributes, we've got the focal length and the orientation solved, and we've got some indirectly solved here for the X, Y and Z vanishing points. And that's kind of all you need. If I just hit my middle mouse button here and go into like the top view, for example, you can see we've got the camera and it's sort of looking, it's nice and wide, it's quite level, it's not too bad, but that's all we need. So what I'm going to do now is just create a camera mapping tag. I create a background object as well, just to double check, but we won't actually be needing this background object because the background object in Cinema 4D does not render out in Corona. Well, not the version of Corona that I've got anyway. So clicking out of the camera calibrate tag, when it's not selected, just brings us into this viewport here where we can see the thing. Now my axis, my world axis, the 0 is actually just off. I'm to bring that into the corner of the room. I'm just going to click back on the calibrate tag because this is something I forgot, and I'm going to add a pin. And then this pin, I'm just going to drag, you can see add pin is in the attributes down here, and then there's a little yellow circle here on the screen. I'm going to click that and just drag it down, and it should just snap to the corner of those lines there, where those lines join. So with that there, you'll see that my world axis is now zeroed in. So if I bring in a cube, there it is in my scene. Now scaling, because this cube, if I just bring in a cube, it's 2000 millimeters by 2000, and it looks very small for that size, 2 meters in that room. So I have measured these walls because I've been there in person, and I have I know how tall they are. So if I bring in a plane and just put that onto, let's say, the Z-axis here, and what I'm going to do is just make sure it's the width segments are just 1 by 1. I'm just going to make it editable. I'm hitting the middle mouse button here to go into these views, go into the front view, press L to be able to move my axis, Alt S to turn on snapping. I'm just going to turn on edge snapping, snap that down to the bottom, hit L again so it can move, and just zero that out. So my plane is now, the bottom of that plane is bang on 0 on the flat floor. Now I know these walls because I measured them. As you can see, my plane is coming at 4000 millimeters, but I know this wall is about 2620 millimeters, give or take. So there's the height of my wall. Now we see it doesn't fit, but because I am controlling this camera, I can hold Alt and I can use my right mouse button to actually move my camera forward or backwards. Now because that pin is locked on that corner, I can keep the bottom of my plane bang on the bottom of the wall, and I can just zoom in enough so that plane, we're not changing the size of the plane, it's still 2620 millimeters, but what I'm doing is just scaling the camera forward and backwards, so that height just about matches the top of the wall there. So and then once I'm happy with that, I just right click on camera, go to Cinema 4D tags, and just turn on protection. So if I accidentally try and move the camera, I won't lose that scaling. Okay, we're just going to hide the plane for a moment, because what I'm going to do first is come down here to where the materials are, and we've got two materials. We've got one that looks a little bit darker and one that looks a bit brighter. The darker one is for the background object, because, you know, if we turn that off, it's gone. But we don't actually need that background object. What we need to do is just double click on the lighter one, which is actually coming through the luminance channel, and we're just going to go to editor and just turn the texture preview size up a little bit, like 256 megabytes or something like that. I'm going to bring in a cube and make it editable, and again just bring the axis down. You can use this tool here, the enable axis modification tool, or you can use the shortcut L on the keyboard. Just bring it down to the bottom, and then with that deselected, I can just drag that up, or come down here to the position and just zero that out, so that cube is smack bang on the bottom. Now if I come out of my camera view, we've still got the background. I'm just going to turn that off for a second and make it so it doesn't render either. We can see the camera, we can see the cube. Now I'm going to hold Control and click on this camera texture tag here on the camera object, and just hold Control and just drag that up to the cube. And what that's actually doing is camera mapping the picture onto that object. Okay. Now here's the trickery. What I'm going to do is just select that object, and I'm going to actually scale in the wall here, so the bottom edge of this cube lines up with the bottom of that skirting board. And I'm also going to bring it in, because the skirting board, what we're doing actually is modeling in 3D that skirting board, the rough sort of thickness. So I'm just going to do this very, very quickly. So just bring in all those edges. Okay. So what we've got here is the rough skirting board. We've got to find out where that sort of edge ends. Bring it up a little bit, like that. Bring the back in, line it up with, you can just about see the texture of the wall where the line sort of meets. You can sort of bring the edge into that, and then just extend that skirting out. Okay, we'll just leave the skirting there for a second, bring back that plane. So I'm just going to make that plane visible, and what I'm going to do is hold Control and again just bring that texture tag, actually it's done both of them, so let's just delete one. There we go. Bring that texture tag in for the wall, which is going to be the wall behind the skirting, and I'm just going to go into the top view and just make sure I move that with snapping on, just snap that to the back of the skirting. So if we come into the bottom here, you can see we've got 3D geometry with that texture from the photograph on it. Okay. Now, again, modeling this plane, we're just going to bring in the edges to roughly the sort of corner of the room, like that, and then we can hold Control and just drag it out for the Z-axis. Bring that down until it's sort of, until you stop seeing the texture anymore. That's because that's no longer what the camera was seeing, so the camera mapping stops. But what we're starting to do is build up the geometry of the room bit by bit. And again, I'll bring in another plane, make it one width segment by one height segment, make it editable, drag the same camera tag onto it, and then from the top view, bring it all in and create that floor as well. Okay, so we've got a floor. So I'm just going to finish off this skirting as well, because now, as we can see, we've now got geometry that now overlaps the wall. So what I'm going to do is just go into the top view, right click, I'm in line mode, I'm just going to go to line cut, make sure visible only is unchecked, just hold shift and drag a from the corner. Just drag a diagonal 45-degree line just to cut through there, and then I'm just going to select those lines and delete like that. So now I've got a 45-degree cut in my geometry. I'm going to press U on the keyboard. No, I'm not. It's not working. U, and I'm going to press L for loop selection. There we are. And then that's going to select that whole loop. I'm just going to drag it. Hold on a moment. We've got a problem. Okay, I'm going to delete these lines again. UL, select that. How bizarre. Okay. In this case, I've got some strange geometry there where it's doing this. I'm just going to Control Z undo. I'm just going to Control A, select everything, and I'm just going to right click and go to Optimize and see if that fixes the problem. There we go. Okay, so that's just optimized the geometry. Any kind of duplicated points, it's just merged them into one. And so I fixed that sort of bad geometry. So I'm just going to bring that inside my scene. Swing my camera around. Now you see I haven't got my camera visible. I'm not looking through the camera lens at the moment, so I can freely move my camera around by holding Alt and just clicking. Or you can use these tools up here to sort of rotate. So I'm just going to bring my geometry into the rough corner. You can do that as well by just bringing that point up and just dragging it in and making it fit that geometry. Then I'm going to hold Control and just bring that out as well. Okay, so it's slightly off, it's not perfect, but we can fix that. So I'm just going to go into my scale tool, and this 45-degree cut, I'm just going to hold Shift, click on the Z axis, hold Shift, and just drag it down to 0%. If I do that right, 0%, and that should flatten that, so I can drag it out. Okay, now I'm in the edge selection mode. I'm just going to go into my rectangular selection, select a whole bunch of the geometry there, and just reposition that so it kind of fits with the camera mapping. And again, go into my plane, select that face, and just drag that out a little bit. It's a bit of trial and error to get it right. Just make sure that snaps to that geometry. There we are. Okay, and make sure that ground plane as well snaps back. Okay, very good. So now we've got that sort of geometry again. And I'm just going to again just drag out that skirting board all the way. Now the skirting board is important. The reason why I'm modeling the skirting board and not just having it flat is because when you have objects in the scene that cast certain shadows, you kind of want that shadow casting on the geometry of the skirting board, just to create that little bit of distortion in the shadow. It makes it look a little bit more realistic as well. And we're going to do the same with the radiator as well. We don't have to sort of do any of the modeling of the knobs and the pipes, just really for the main cube or rectangle of the radiator itself. Okay, but I'm just going to finish the walls, the skirting, and the ceiling. Okay, so here we are. So I've just sped that up a little bit and just modeled this. So what I've done is created the geometry for the walls, the 3 walls that are visible, the ground plane, and then duplicated that ground plane, just dragged it up to the top of the walls there and snapped it to the geometry just to create the ceiling plane as well. And as we can see, it's actually not quite matching up, so we're just going to drag that up a little bit more and match those up a little bit. So come back to this plane, select the tops, and just drag those up. And it can be a good idea to just turn off snapping, just to get that, you know, that more sort of precision there with the. There we are. And then just bring that top plane back down to meet the walls with snapping on, so it snaps to the edge. There we are. Okay, so there we are. So we got those walls, we got the geometry of the skirting, we got the geometry of the floor. Okay, so I'm just going to create the geometry now for the radiator. So again, just bring in a cube, make it editable, sort of bring it into the sort of rough position, scale it down. Just be very quick and rough right now. That's it. I'm just going to put the camera mapping tag onto it and drag it into position. Now we know that the radiator touches the wall, so I'm just going to go into the edge mode, select that back edge and just bring it, snap it to the wall. Then I'm going to select the top, just bring that, snap it to there, bring the front, bring it to there, so we can see from the texture where the edges are. We can sort of line up. Again, bring this to this side like that. As we can see that it's not perfectly straight, that there's some sort of bends there, so we can just try and match that as much as possible. Bit of distortion there by the lens, that's all that is. Bring it down to the bottom like there, and bring that across to there. Doesn't matter that you can see the texture on the wall behind it, the overlap, because when we look through the camera lens, that anything that's sort of hidden behind there is not visible. You can't see the top of you know, through the lens there. We can't see the top plane. I'm not sure what's happened there. Oh, we've lost the camera tag, that's why. There we are. I must have moved the camera tag up rather than duplicate it. Yeah, so there we go. Okay, so to create the window, we're going to actually create the geometry of the window as well. And we're going to do that simply just by doing a boolean. So we're going to come to our plane. You can rename these. You can call these walls, floor, if you want. You know, that helps too. I just haven't for speed. So this is the skirting. This is our floor. This is our ceiling. And this is our radiator. Okay. So we're going to come to the walls. Yeah, we're going to select that plane and we're going to right click and just go to extrude, or I've got some buttons up here, shortcuts, and we're just going to make sure we create caps, and we're just going to extrude it by however thick we want the wall. I always do it overly thick. 54 centimeters, 540 millimeters is nice and thick, just to create that geometry there for that wall. Then create a cube, and again make it editable. Just make sure we're in object mode, just scale it down, model mode I mean, and just bring that up and position that roughly where the window is. Again, bring the I'm holding control, clicking on a texture tag and just dragging that up and creating that texture tag there for the material, and just sort of roughly putting it in place of where the window will be. In fact, we'll create the ball right now. So I'm clicking on walls. I'll hold Alt and I'll come up here to the these options, and by holding click and selecting ball with Alt held as well, that will put the walls under the boolean, and just drag the cube down there under the walls, and we're going to then create a ball for the window. I'm just going to bring the back edge in to line up with the edge of where the wall sort of ends. That would be good. And then make sure that the top of that cube lines up with the top edge of the walls. And there is a bit of distortion on this photo. As you can see, the corner doesn't quite match up, but that's okay. Okay, I'm just going to drag this cube down. And again, you can take your time and you can be a bit more accurate. I'm just doing this as quick as I can for the sake of the tutorial. Just turn off snapping so there's no jumping about. And then just make sure that back edge then really does line up with the wall. There we go. So what's that's created is the geometry of that. You can see the perspective change as we move the camera, so there is that indentation in the wall. So that's the basis of modeling the room. The basics. You can model in a cube for the sticky out bit of the windowsill, I guess, you know, where it juts out from the wall a bit. You can go into that length if you want, but I'm not going to do that for the sake of this tutorial. Again, like I said, you can be as detailed as you want. Okay, so my scaling should be fine, my modeling should be fine. So if I go into my camera view and let's just bring in a model for scale. So I'm going to go to, I know this is a bedroom, but I'm going to go into sofas and armchairs and just bring in a chic armchair, which is going to be my just test model that I can then move around on the scale, and it snaps to the floor, and it's the right scale for the room. Okay, so lighting is the next step, and shadow catchers. Okay, so what we've got is all of this geometry for the room. I'm just going to select it all and just hold Alt and press G just to group them into a null, and I'm going to call that ref or reference. And the reason why I'm doing this is because this is going to be what we see, but we're not going to render any of this. So we're just going to make sure that the render tag is off there. So this is just going to be what we see. Now the reason why I do this, and I'm going to duplicate this now, is because we're now going to create shadow catchers. Now shadow catchers, when you see them in the viewport, especially, well, I don't know if there's a way to do this, and I hope that maybe someone can enlighten me, but when you do a shadow catcher, it just appears in the viewport as black, so you don't see any of the texture. That can be quite difficult, especially if you want to position things in the room. So I create two nulls groups, one as reference and one as shadow catchers. So I've duplicated this now, and I'm just going to just expand it now. So all of these tags here in my reference file, I'm just going to rename as shadow, because these are going to be our shadow catchers. So we're keeping the exact same geometry, we're duplicating the geometry. Well, I'm going to select all those tags and just delete them. Okay. I'm going to come down to the Corona tag here in the Material Manager and just go to Shadow Catcher Material. I'm going to come down to the options, and under Mode I'm going to turn it to Environment, and then that image, the brighter one that we used here, that's not the one being used for the background, which in fact we don't need anymore, so we'll just delete that, and we'll make sure that the texture, the material is deleted as well. So this material here, under our shadow catcher, we can drag that into the environment, and then under mapping we're going to put it as frontal. So this is going to match the camera view. So we've got these two materials now. We can rename this as reference, and we got shadow. Okay, so under the shadow objects, we're going to just drag that shadow catcher material to them all. We can do it this way. I've deleted the tags off all of the objects, but because they're grouped under a null, we can just drag that shadow catcher material onto the null, and it will just map them all to it. And we can do the same with the reference as well if we want. We can just in fact, I'm going to keep them because they're actually using the camera mapping tag rather than the material tag, so they match the camera mapping, which is under camera mapping projection. You can drag that material into it and turn on camera mapping if you want, but it's a bit of a long way. But we're just going to keep the reference as it is. Okay, so as you see, the shadow catcher, if we turn off the reference, this is what it looks like. Okay, so we can't really work with this because we can't see where things go or where the walls end. So I'm just going to make the reference visible, make the shadow catcher invisible, but it's going to render the shadow catcher, but it's not going to render the reference. So we've just got those two there, one just for visibility in the viewport and one for rendering. Okay, so if we render this now as it is, I'm just going to go to Corona and go to interactive rendering. We can see we have this. Okay, so the reference background images are rendering, but we've got no lighting in the scene. We're not using this as a HDR. It's just rendering a very flat image, which doesn't look very good at all. So we're just going to replicate the rendering, the lighting now for the render. So we need a light. There's a big light coming in from this window, spilling in, and I think there was a window as well behind, just off screen on the fourth wall that we can't see. So I'm going to create a Corona light and just drag that in, and I'm going to rotate it to the same sort of orientation of the window and drag that up. Now we want it to sort of match the size of the window, so we'll do that by just looking at the cube that we used as a boolean and taking the measurements from there. So on the y-axis it's here, so I'm just going to copy and paste that into the light, and back to the cube. The z-axis is that. So that's the size. Now we just want to snap it to the where the boolean is, and we want to sort of have it fit in the right coordinates. So what I'm going to do is just drag it up to the corner, copy the x, and then I'm just going to make it sure it's in model mode so we can see the position, and it's moving on the z-axis. So I'm just going to snap that, and then in here I'm just going to do minus, paste in that size, divided by 2, and then that will snap it to the middle there. And then the same with the y. So I'm just going to copy the y, and then in the y, minus, Control V, divided by 2, and then that's going to put it there in the exact position of that window. It's a bit bright at 50 intensity. I turn it down to 15 and just see how it looks. So what we're going to do is just give that a render and see how that looks. Okay, so we've got some light coming in. It's casting a shadow. Still looks very bad. It doesn't look great, and what it's actually doing is rendering that light, so blocking out that view there. So just close that render. In Corona Light, just untick visible directly, and then we'll be able to see the window texture as it is. Now, to fix the issue of the bad shadowing, what we're going to do now is actually create a sky material. Yeah, let me just make this window a bit smaller so we can actually see it happen in real time. So I'm going to come up here and go to sky, and then this reference material that we've got down here, I'm actually going to drag that up and turn that, make that a texture for the sky. So even though it's behind the scene, it's not rendering because we can't see it because we've created the dimensions here in our output, the same as the picture, so there's no overlap of the sky. But what it's doing is just casting a bit of extra light and just softening those shadows, and it creates a very realistic reflection in any kind of chrome material and things like that as well, if we brought in any chrome. So as we see, that's looking quite realistic already. We've got the shadows on the floor, we've got the shadow casting on the wall, and we've got our object there. And that's basically it. You can play around with there, you can bring in more lights. Like I said, I think there is another light in this scene anyway, another window in this room anyway, if I remember rightly. You can see here on the left hand side of the image there's some light sort of spilling in. It's a bit brighter here than it is here, so there's a bit of light coming in from the left hand side. So I could create a second light. All I'd do is just estimate where that window was, because we don't see it, so we can just duplicate that Corona light and just bring it down off camera, rotate it 90 degrees, and again render that again. There we go. We've got a bit of bit more light. It's a bit brighter. We can dim it a little bit, but it just creates a bit of extra light in the scene if we want to sort of make that look a little bit more realistic. In fact, I'm going to just reduce the brightness of that light a little bit, just so it's lighting the scene but not overpowering it, so we still get that more shadow coming from left to right from the first window there. Okay, so the rest of it is just a case of bringing in your furniture and how you want to dress the scene. It's a bedroom. You can bring in a bed, bedside tables, you can put curtains in the window, everything like that. You can drag in a light object, a model, and overlay it roughly where this bulb, this hanging bulb is, and bring in your own ceiling light, which obviously will then, you can light the room with that as well a little bit. But in a nutshell, that is how you do a basic camera mapping of a room to bring in virtual furniture. It's a case of modeling the geometry of the room based on real-world measurements. If you know the height of the walls, modeling any kind of geometry in the room, like I did with the radiator, with the skirting boards, and then it's just matching that light source. I created that boolean to have the depth of the window, and then dropped in a light, corona light, to the exact dimensions of that window, which is no longer visible, so it doesn't render, but it casts that light in the scene. And what you end up with that shadow capture material is you get those realistic shadows bouncing on the walls and on the floor for your models. Okay, so I hope that tutorial was useful, at least to get to this stage. It was a bit of trial and error on my part to get to get it to work like this, having to work out to use the two null group objects of a reference and a shadow catcher. Was a big help once I worked out that, and yeah, and then it's just playing around with your light sources and the brightness and just trying to get that lighting realistic. Okay, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment and ask. I'm happy to help. I'm still learning myself. If you do a very similar process or do something different to obtain similar results, then do let me know, because I'm always learning. I've only been using Corona Renderer for less than a year, but being able to do this, it's very, very powerful, and you can imagine what you can. There's no limit to what you can use it for. So, all right. Well, thank you for taking the time to watch my tutorial. All the best. Ciao.